Hi everyone, my name is James, and today I'm going to show you how I built a woodworking bench. For most woodworkers, a workbench like this is the focal point of their workshop. These things are so expensive that buying one is practically out of the question for most of us. And even building one with a 4-inch thick maple top can cost $2,000 or more. So I decided to go the route of buying Douglas fir lumber from my local big box store. Now it took a while to pick through the lumber and find boards that were very straight, and I was also trying to find boards that were heavy and high density. Now this was kiln dried, so the heavier ones I knew were the higher density ones. I also looked for boards that had no knots on one side so that the top of my bench would be knot free. I built the whole table out of 2x6s, and I had to buy a variety of lengths in order to get enough straight boards. I do offer a comprehensive set of plans, and that's available in the link. And from those I threw some rough dimensions down on my assembly table for me to keep track of as the build goes along. After getting all of my boards to the approximate length, I jointed one edge. My youngest daughter's in the shop with me today, of course, like usual, and she always gives me a hand when I have a lot of jointing and planing to do. It speeds things up, and she really has a good time. After getting one straight edge on the jointer, I ripped the other side parallel on the table saw. Then it's back to the jointer in order to get one face perfectly flat. And my oldest daughter is in the shop helping us today as well. Once we have one side flat, it's off to the planer for the final milling operation to get the other side parallel to that first. Once the milling is done, we're now dealing with lumber that is perfectly straight, square, flat, and parallel on all sides, and it's so much easier to work with. Yeah, sometimes I'm not sure if she likes the camera more or woodworking more. All of this planing and jointing really generates a lot of wood chips. Whenever I have clean wood shavings that come from a lumber species that is not toxic, I always save them and we donate them to our local animal shelter. And here we are getting ready for our first glue up. What we're building is a split top Roubo style bench. So it's going to be built in two sections like this with a split down the middle, and we're going to glue up the first half now. If you've seen other videos of mine, you know I like to use a lot of glue, and today will be no exception. It seems to me when you have a great big surface area and a whole lot of glue to spread, the fastest thing to do is to put on nitrile gloves and just do it by hand. Also, gluing things up that way makes it go much faster, so if you've got a big project to glue up, this can really help you out. And if we have a really big area to clamp, we have to remember that it takes a lot of clamps to get enough pressure to ensure that it's clamped down securely. I let this dry overnight, and then I took the clamps off, and I went about scraping the big chunks and beads of excess glue off of it before I took it over to my planer. I have a 15-inch planer, so I can do a 14 or 15-inch wide section, but depending on the size of your planer, you might have to make this in two smaller glue ups, and then put them together after the fact. Once that's done, I take it over to the jointer to get both sides. So basically we will treat the second half the same way as the first, and after about 2 days we have the two sides of our split top Roubo workbench. Since I'm tired of moving those heavy things around, I'm going to jump over to the legs, and I'll come back later and show you just how heavy those were. And we're just going to follow the same procedure here. We're going to start by rough cutting everything to the same length, about an inch or two over, and then joint it, plane it, and cut it parallel. While I'm at it, I'm just doing the same thing with all of the rails that I'm doing here with the legs. I'm going to go ahead and glue the legs up first, and here's how that procedure goes. You notice some bad tear out probably on the edges of some of those boards, and that's actually okay because these leg pieces are actually wider than the legs, and those are going to be ripped off in operation later. And if you look real carefully there, you can see we have just exactly the right amount of glue. I'm going to go ahead and put all 4 leg assemblies into a single clamping stack to save on some clamps. So hopefully I can get all the legs and rails clamped up today. Obviously, this operation is easier if you have somebody helping you out. And I did in fact get all of the legs and rails clamped up today, but that's all the parallel clamps I had, so I lucked out. This also I let dry overnight. I came back in the morning and unclamped it and started my next milling operation. They pretended to be a little bit stuck together, but they were just kidding. The first step again is, of course, just to get one perfectly straight edge. And if you applied enough clamping pressure, you can see that they typically will glue up quite nicely. Next, I'm over to the table saw to rip the other end parallel to the first. I do happen to have a 12-inch blade, so I'm able to just barely get through this stack. If you have a smaller blade, a 10-inch blade, it's no problem. You just rip half of it, flip the board over, and rip the other half. Finally, I'll just get all edges square and clean on the planer. With the milling complete, I'm going to cut all the pieces to the exact length on the chop saw. And that's it. The legs and rails are all complete, and I'm very happy, as you can see. Okay, nothing left to do but to go back to these big heavy pieces. In order to cut the ends off, I'm going to clamp them together as if they're one piece, make a straight line, put a straight edge on there, and then cut it on both sides with my circular saw. I might as well take a little bit of time to mark and cut the ends, because everything that I don't cut with the circular saw, I'm going to have to cut out with my hand saw. And that's it. No specialty tool here. I could probably use a reciprocating saw, something like a Sawzall, but I think that'd be too violent. I think I'll get a cleaner cut with just this handsaw. You can see the cut clearly isn't perfect, but that's not really a problem. We're going to spend a few minutes with the belt sander. I'm going to sand it down, and then I'm going to move to my random orbit sander. With the belt sander, I'm actually going to start very aggressive here. I'm going to start with a 36 grit. This might seem like it's too much, but it's really not. We're dealing with end grain. These are some fairly high density boards. Even though it's a softwood, it still took me a little bit of time with 36 grit to get this down to flat. After the belt sander took it down to where I felt like it was completely flat and smooth, I switched to my random orbit sander and I put on 60 grit paper here. And even this took quite a while. I wanted to make sure I took out all of the scratches from the belt sander and get it even smoother still. After that, I moved up to 100 and stopped. I didn't want to go any finer than that at this point. You can see that the end grain of these boards has a lot of checks in it. I was actually going to cut another few inches off of the end, and I probably would have eliminated the checks, but I decided to go ahead and go with a slightly longer bench instead. And so I vacuumed out the sawdust, and I'm actually going to fill it with this wood putty that I'm making. I simply collected a bunch of sawdust, Douglas fir sawdust, this exact species, from my sander, and I would do that with every job really. I keep sawdust on, aside in case I have to make some putty. I mix it with glue until I get just the right consistency. I have found that this actually works much better than store-bought putty since my binding agent is actual high-quality wood glue. I can force it deep into the cracks or check marks, and not only does it end up looking very much like the wood, but I think the glue helps hold the checks or cracks together and they never get any worse. It is important to note for a project like this especially that this is only a cosmetic problem. Having cracks or checks at the end of a giant beefy workbench like this is not in any way a structural problem. Once I let that dry fully, I went ahead and sanded it off with the same 80 grit paper that I was using before. After that, I moved to 100 grit and got the entire surface thoroughly. I'm just going to quickly wipe on a little bit of mineral spirits, which will sort of be like a mock finish, so I can see if I have any deep scratches that I might have missed from the belt sander or from the rougher grits. If I had found any deep scratches, I could have moved back to a coarser grit and then worked my way back finer again to get them removed. It turns out I was lucky this time and everything turned out well, and the two halves of my split top Roubo workbench are now actually done. At this point, I'm going to shift gears and I'm going to do a comprehensive layout for all of the mortise and tenon joints that will go into the legs and the rails for the whole structure underneath the top. I am drawing a lot of lines, and rather than me try to explain each one and maybe it's sounding confusing, I'll kind of let the video play out and I think it will become obvious what they're all for. And in case you didn't notice, there is the photo bomber now. It is handy to keep these things clamped up. Here, for example, I have all four legs clamped together as a single unit, so I can transfer these lines all the way across at once. Another important thing to keep track of is not losing what leg is what. So I have a little temporary layout that I have drawn on my assembly table identifying legs 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'm also going to mark it on the bottoms of the legs as well, and this will kind of help me remember what tenons go where. And in the future, you'll kind of see how that plays out as well. I'm also taking care to note each leg, which side of the leg is the front, which side of the leg is the side, or which might be the left, which might be the right, things like that. This will all help in my orientation or layout later. And finally, I like to stand them up in three-dimensional space there and just make a quick check and make sure that they match up with the sketch the 3D sketch that I put on my assembly table. Then I'll go back to the leg, each leg, and I'll identify that portion of the leg. Here you can see the long rail attaches into there. I'll identify the section of the leg where the short rail attaches also. And now you might be able to see what is happening here. I am laying out the mortise for this leg. The mortise that is the very center portion, and the area all the way around the mortise is where the shoulders of the tenon are going to touch. I typically put X's in the mortise because that's the material that has to be removed. And the area where I'm writing short rail doesn't even have to be sanded off because that's going to be underneath the shoulders of the tenon. And there she is again. I swear we only catch about 5% of what she does when we're actually filming. We find them all later when I'm going through and reviewing the video. Okay, with everything laid out on the legs, I like to put them back up again in 3 dimensions and make sure that the long rail faces long rail, short rail faces short rail, and everything meshes up in 3D space. It's pretty disheartening with the time that it takes to build a leg to accidentally put a mortise in the wrong place. And here's our group of legs, and that mortise was in fact in the right place. We just started before I decided to stop and catch that shot. And here are all of the rails, the 4 short rails and the 2 long rails. There are many ways to remove the material from the mortise. One way is using a router. One way is that can simply be chiseled out. Another way, which if you have a drill press or even just a drill, you can kind of hog out a lot of the material first with the drill, and that makes chiseling the edges square a lot easier and faster. Once the material is removed, I like to start chiseling by going lightly once around the perimeter to kind of identify the edge. I have seen many ways of doing this, and I'm sure that most people's ways are better than mine. I am mostly a power tool user. I have been woodworking for almost 32 years now, but I use almost exclusively power tools. I decided to do this workbench entirely with hand-cut mortise and tenons, and I've probably only done a dozen or so of these in my life, so I'm not an expert, but chiseling softwood is actually pretty easy, so I thought I would go ahead and do these this way to show everybody how it's done in the event that you don't have a router. Oh, I just realized I said hand-cut mortise and tenons. I suppose I lied about that. I meant to say hand-cut mortises. I will cut the tenons on my table saw. I think a crosscut sled is a must-have accessory for a table saw. This is a crosscut sled with a wide groove in it, so I'm going to call it my crosscut dado sled. I did make the tenoning really easy for myself here. What I did is I made my legs exactly 4 inches by 5 inches, and I made sure that my mortise was just 1 inch smaller on all sides than the outside of the leg. Therefore I had to raise my blade up by 1 inch, and I just left it at that height and cut all the way around it. A method like this makes for a very fast, very clean, and very easy tenon. After cutting the tenons on 2 rails, I did a quick dry fit just to make sure it worked out. So here, a common problem that someone might run into is if you have rails that are at the same height, then they're going to come into each other. They're going to cut into each other at some point. And so what I've done is I've taken the short rails and I've put a little notch in them so that the long rails will fit inside of them when they go inside of the leg. And again, this is highly detailed in my plans. That wraps up the rails and legs, all the mortises and tenons, and the top. I hope you come back to see the second video and how this bench comes together. Thank you for watching.